We first learned of the famous swords through Kuwaina, noticing Zoro's Wado Ichimonji. Well, not Kuwaina, but Tashigi, but she looked exactly like Kuwaina back in Locktown. And we found out that they were pretty much that Kuwaina sword that was handed down to Zoro was a part of the 21 great swords. And of course, we all know that Tashigi made a vow to take away from the evil men and obtain the 50 skill graded swords, the 21 great swords, and of course the 12 supreme grade swords, which this video is all about. And you guys know these swords are my favorite. So after the recent new addition to the supreme grade swords that happened in the SBS, let's do a deep dive on, of course, the already existing swords and of course the missing supreme grade swords yet to be revealed, because I feel like we've already seen some of these supreme grades and Oda just hasn't revealed them yet. So the newest addition is of course the Yakuza Kazin, a cane sword that of course was forged by the Fugetsu Kisaboru of the Fugetsu family from Wano. This sword belongs to Fujitora, having of course him having a supreme grade sword from Wano definitely answers some interesting questions, as of course he wears Wano like outfits. And with his character coming from nowhere, it makes sense that he stayed in Wano for a bit, of course, because it's closed off to the rest of the world. Now, I must admit, him having this elite level sword will definitely spice up his future battles with, of course, Rono or Zoro of the future Pirate King crew. And of course, maybe some past interactions with maybe Mihawk, who knows? And even crazier if he had an interaction with Kozuki Oden if he was on Wano around the same time. I doubt it though. Still, all in all, I'm more hyped to see Fujitora in the future because he has such an elite level sword. And supreme grades are only held by the strongest of strongest in the One Piece story. And speaking of the strongest, the Murakumogiri is one of the more interesting supreme grade swords because it's not a conventional sword. I never really truly viewed it as a sword, if I'm being honest, but of course Oda mentioned it as a supreme grade because it was held by Whitebeard. Whitebeard was using it during Marineford War, but I must admit, seeing Whitebeard clash with Kozuki Oden in the past definitely made it more, how to say this, make more sense that he's had a legendary sword, a supreme grade sword, because he's going up against a legendary swordsman in Kozuki Oden out of Wano, and then fighting the Pirate King Goldie Roger, who we know also has a supreme grade level sword, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. And of course they had that Conqueror's Haki coding clash where their weapons weren't even touching, and Whitebeard's looks like, let's be honest here, it looks like Whitebeard in his past was more weapon based than his older days, and it makes sense now why Mihawk wanted to see the distance between Whitebeard and the rest of us, because Mihawk also has a supreme grade sword, which I'll talk about a little bit later too. So definitely want to say this was very cool to see how the context and everything starts to make sense once Oda reveals these type of things. Now let's talk about Ace, and not Porcus the Ace, the son of the Pirate King. I'm talking, of course, Goldie Roger's sword. I'm talking about the Ace, the supreme grade sword that belonged to the Pirate King. I know it's confusing, but stay with me for a little bit. As we've seen, of course, the first time we've seen this was against Shiki during the Ed War. And of course, we also seen it very more clear versus Whitebeard during their clash. And so it makes sense why he was so obsessed to see the samurai Kozuki Oden around this time, as of course he held one of the most goated swords in the One Piece world. And of course, Roger was one of the strongest swordsmen who had no double ability. This was confirmed by Kaido. So I want to say this, I can't leave out that Roger didn't have his sword during God Valley. So he might have got this sword after his battle with Roxy Zebek, another swordsman, or at another time. All I'm saying is it only makes sense the man who made it to Laughtale also has a top tier sword in the One Piece story. It only makes sense. Now the Shodai Kitetsu is probably the most interesting of the supreme grade swords because we don't actually have confirmation on who has it. If anything, we only know it's a supreme grade because Oda specifically talked about it in the Cursed Blade family, and of course explains how the first Kitetsu was the strongest, that being the Shodai Kitetsu, as a supreme grade. Now I must admit, we pretty much have been theorizing that the Bald Gorosei has had this sword for years in the One Piece community, but with the recent Egghead Island arc showcasing Venus Juru with one of the best swordsman's feat, cutting Egghead Island in half, the dome, that was insane. And of course Zoro noticing his Kitetsu blade while he noticed, of course, Zoro's Sandai Kitetsu, it's pretty obvious who holds the unknown supreme grade sword, and I wonder how Oda will continue the lore of one of the more spooky swords in the story. Just know Venus Juru is definitely related to Wano and his days during the Void Century. It's pretty much confirmed once he gets revealed with the Shodai Kitetsu, so the hype is real. And lastly, now we talk about, in my opinion, the greatest sword in this group of greatest swords in the series. Yes, the Yoru, which is of course also a black blade, which is not a surprise when the world's strongest swordsman is the owner. And I must admit, when you have a greater sword skill than of course Mr. Divine Departure and of course Red Hair Shanks himself, while also of course being the King of Hell Zoro's endgame, for goodness sake, he's the only Yonko commander with a higher bounty than his Yonko captain. So enough of the Mihawk lays in this video, but I want to say this: his sword is just built different, no diddy, and the only other sword we can compare is of course Shisui, which was owned by the goat of Wana Ryuma, known as the sword god, and of course he also had a black blade as well. So definitely a lot of similarities here, but we have to understand there was a major difference. One was the supreme grade sword, and Shisui of course was not that supreme grade. So you see why the GOAT sword currently in the One Piece story has to belong to Mihawk. Now before I dive into the remaining supreme grade swords, let's talk about some of the other group sets of swords. And of course the next down in the line in ranks is of course the 21 great blades. From finding out Wado Ichimonji was created by a Wano samurai in Shimotsuki Kuzaburo, and handed down to, of course, to Koshiro, then to Koena, and all the way to of course Rono Zoro, who most likely will turn into a black blade, being it's the first sword pretty much that he actually held with a name. And it'll be, of course, he'll actually be the first swordsman to have multiple black blades in my opinion, but that's another video for another day. And then of course we also have the Shodai Kitetsu, which was wasted by having Monkey D. Luffy use it during Wano, which was hilarious of course. And I also have to talk about the Ame no Habakiri, Odin's legendary sword that now belongs to the Shogun and son of Odin, Momonosuke, and will definitely have a big moment during the final saga, of course. But this sword is overshadowed by Odin's other sword, Enma, which of course had Big Mom and Kaido shook during the rooftop, of course, battle. And it absorbs conquers haki from legends like Odin and now King of Hell, Rono Zoro. And finally, let's be honest here, this is the only sword where I've seen people actually say it wasn't the swordsman, it was actually the sword. That is a elite level sword in my opinion. And of course finally the greatest great blade, Shisui, the Wano treasure that belonged to of course the goat samurai Ryuma, who turned it into a black blade. Don't underestimate these swords just because they ain't supreme grade. And of course we also have 16 unknown great swords in the world, expected more to be revealed in the final saga by some powerful swordsmen, if I'm being honest. Now the next group of swords in the rank of swords in the One Piece world is the 50 skillful grade blades, and we only know 3 of them. Kashu, which belonged to of course Baroque's works Mr. 11, that Tashigi took after beating him off screen in a duel. And then there's Yubashiri, which Zoro compliments its lightweight during the Whiskey Peak incident, and of course was rusted by a marine at the end of Eni's lobby. And then we also have the lowest of the 4 groups of swords, and that's the grade blade. Tashigi owns of course one of them called the Shigure, which is still impressive even though it's the lowest rank of the 4 groups of ranked swords or famous swords. And the other is owned by Zoro. It's a curse blade called Shodai Kitetsu, which of course is connected to the Shodai Kitetsu, a supreme grade, so I will give Zoro the benefit of the doubt for holding the sword all the way up to now, which I can't wait for Zoro to upgrade as it's his weakest sword, though I must admit it's iconic for how Zoro risks cutting his arm during Lockdown, testing his luck, and how it's been a staple since. Zoro's been in the Grand Line, from his fight to Mr. 1 all the way to his recent battles versus King and Rob Lucci. So enough of the recap. Let's actually start theorizing where the 7 unknown supreme grade swords reside. And I'm gonna start with Silver's Rayleigh's sword. We've seen him first use it versus the Admiral Kizaru when things got serious, to him of course flexing his Conqueror's coding haki against Blackbeard after the time skip, the vice captain to the Pirate King Goldie Roger, who also had a supreme grade weapon. You have to look at it like this, for goodness sake. Rayleigh was known, his moniker was the Dark King, so expect a badass supreme grade with that moniker to also accompany him. It's probably my most simplest guess right now. Now let's talk about the Griffin sword, held by of course Red Hair Shanks, the only Yonko swordsman. Let's be honest here, if he's the only Yonko swordsman, a supreme grade sword is definitely in his books. And you have to understand this, the last Yonko that had a sword that was taken down was Whitebeard, and he also had a supreme grade sword. Now of course the fact that Shanks is doing Roger level attacks with Divine Departure, and of course he battled Dracula Mihawk when he had 2 arms, a black blade supreme grade user. I'll tell you guys right now, not just once, he battled Mihawk many times, and we know Mihawk's bounty was revealed when they're revealing Mihawk's bounty, they use Shanks to hype up Mihawk when it comes to having greater sword skill than Shanks. I think the hype of the world's greatest swordsman, if using Shanks, Shanks might be the second greatest swordsman after losing his arm. So I wouldn't be surprised if Oda gives him a supreme grade as well, and you already have a sick name with it called the Griffin. I think it will be cool to see. Now the next sword is definitely going to be raising eyebrows, but I'm talking about Raui, or whatever how you pronounce it, the sword used by Shiryu the Rain, a moniker that reminds me of Wano. Like, Shiryu the Rain is such a Wano-like name. Now I have many reasons why this sword could be a supreme grade. The fact that it gave Garp his biggest wound in that battle, that Aokiji was the main guy battling Garp, that was crazy. And the fact that Shooter the Rain cut down the Emperor down prisoners immediately after getting the sword, and how big the sword is in general, it's definitely a sleeper pick for a hidden supreme grade sword, or at least minimum a great grade sword. But I would put it here for the guess of having a unknown remaining supreme grade, because Shooter the Rain has a big part in playing in the final saga. Now I got a 2-for-1 special for this one. Yes, I'm talking about the swords obviously called Oto and Kogorashi, said to be famous by, of course, their swordsman in Chapter 0, and that's the legendary Shiki. So why not make them both supreme grade swords, like his fellow legends Roger and Whitebeard from his era? And the fact that he was there on God Valley and portrayed as a top rocks pirate shows how much Oda respects Shiki in the One Piece story, even breaking his own rules for his Delver ability. Yes, so 2 supreme grade swords definitely could make sense here, but right now I definitely feel like at least 1 minimum. Now, if Oda doesn't want to give Shiki a supreme grade sword, that would also make sense as well, but it would leave 3 left for us to guess, and the obvious guess for me could be Roxy Zebek, the captain of Shiki, and also Whitebeard, a known supreme grade sword user. And of course, we know that he also had a sword that was laying on his shoulder in chapter 957 as he goes on to fight Roger and Garp. So we can forget like him not being a swordsman. That was already confirmed. Now we have to talk about how you want to be the king of the world. So supreme grade for a man trying to be king of the world, in my opinion, is very, very fitting. Now let's talk about Figureland Garland, who was the strongest holy knight on by far on God Valley. Like, that was showcased very, very clearly in Egghead Island in that flashback. And he also fought a young Roger as well on this island. Now I do want to say this, he lived to be an old man who of course is executing celestial dragons, so he has a lot of respect on Mary Joa's for sure. And many people suspect him to be Shanks' father because of Film Red and how they theorize Figureland is connected to Shanks, which will most likely have a supreme grade sword for Figureland Garland because he's such an elite swordsman from Mary Joa's. Now I do want to say this, if Oda wants the commander of the Holy Knights to be a big player when it comes to the One Piece, Oda will definitely give him a big sword when it comes to of course, the One Piece race at the end. And finally, let's talk about it. Shanks' brother, or it's not his brother confirmed right now, but let's be honest here. Figureland Garland being Shanks' dad, I know that's not confirmed. I'm assuming a lot right now, but it's pretty much a guess that a lot of people are making, and if we're right, we won't be shocked. But for the fun of it, let's just talk about who this hidden swordsman is in the final page of chapter 1121 and the most recent panel that was iconic alongside other prominent characters after the One Piece. So this hidden swordsman will probably have a supreme grade sword, especially if it's a new era strongest holy knight in his prime. That if it's Shanks' twin, I don't really care. It just has to be a monster swordsman from Mary Joa's. Now yeah, that's me guessing, of course, the leftover supreme grade swords that are out there in the One Piece world. Now I do want to say this, who wields them is fun, but I must admit, I truly would be happy if these new unknown characters held them, like characters we never seen before, or if they were just hidden on islands like Elbaf or even Laftel. All I can say for certain is any weapon could be a supreme grade after seeing Whitebeard, of course, in this supreme grade group. So characters like, of course, Katakuri with his Mogura, or Gabon with his battle axe, they could also be supreme grades knowing Oda. But of course, knowing how I look at the story, I guess not. But if he goes that direction, I wouldn't be surprised. But right now, I do doubt that they have supreme grades. But I definitely am excited to see where Oda goes with the 7 remaining supreme grades, because that means there's more unrevealed than there's actually revealed. In the final saga, at the end of the One Piece story, that'll be the perfect time to reveal all these supreme grade swords, in my opinion.